A woman stands in the crowd at Tower Hill. May 17th, 1536, 6 in the morning. The scaffold rises above the mass of bodies, thousands packed so tight you can smell yesterday's sweat, mixing with this morning's fear. She's wearing black, full mourning dress. Her husband isn't dead yet, won't be for another hour. But she knows, everyone knows. The drums start, that slow, deliberate rhythm that announces a traitor's death. 5 men are about to die. George Boleyn, Viscount Rochford, her husband, is one of them. Accused of sleeping with his own sister. Convicted of incest with Queen Anne Boleyn. Sentenced to the traitor's death. Hanged, cut down while breathing, castrated, disemboweled while still conscious, then beheaded. The crowd presses forward. Vendors sell pies and ale. Children perch on shoulders for a better view. A woman next to Jane is eating an apple, juice running down her chin, eyes bright with anticipation. This is entertainment. Death as public spectacle. A morning's diversion before the markets open. Does Jane watch? The records don't say. Nobody thought to write down where the condemned men's wives stood during executions. Women's locations weren't important unless they were queens. But she hears it. The entire city hears it. The roar when the first man climbs the scaffold. The sudden hush as he begins his speech. The collective intake of breath before the executioner acts. And then, because Henry shows mercy at the last moment. Not the screams of disemboweling, but the single heavy thud of the axe blade hitting the block. 5 times that sound echoes across Tower Hill. 5 heads, 5 pools of blood soaking into the scaffold wood. The tower guns fire. The boom rolls across London like thunder. It's done. Jane Boleyn is a widow at 31 years old. In 3 weeks her entire world has shattered. Her sister-in-law arrested for adultery. Her husband arrested for incest. 5 men she knows from court, men she's danced with, dined with, laughed with, all dead before the morning's half finished. The Boleyn family, the most powerful in England just a month ago, has been systematically destroyed. And according to every history book, written in the last 5 centuries, Jane helped make it happen. They say she testified against her husband and sister-in-law, say she told Cromwell's investigators that George and Anne spent too much time alone together, that their relationship looked sexual, that something unnatural was happening behind closed doors. They say she was jealous, vindictive, so consumed with hatred for the glamorous, powerful Boleyn family that she was willing to watch her own husband's head roll just to see them fall. They call her the most toxic in-law in history, the woman who betrayed her family, the viper in the nest, the ultimate cautionary tale about what happens when women let jealousy consume them. There's just one problem with this story. Almost none of it is true. The testimony? Probably. Never happened? At minimum, it's unproven. The jealousy? Pure invention by historians who needed a motive. The vindictiveness? Fabricated decades after Jane's death by writers with clear political agendas. But here's what makes Jane Boleyn's story truly fascinating. She survives. Against all odds, against all probability, she navigates the destruction of the Boleyn family and keeps breathing, claws her way back to court, back to power, back to serving queens. And then 5 years later, she does it all again. Same charges, same tower, same scaffold, same executioner's blade waiting, 2 queens executed for adultery, Jane Boleyn right in the middle of both disasters. Coincidence? Terrible luck? Or something darker that we've completely misunderstood? Tonight we're pulling apart the legend. We're looking at what actually happened versus what we've been told for 500 years. We're examining the evidence and the shocking lack of it. We're tracing Jane's life from unremarkable noble marriage to blood-soaked scaffold. And we're asking the questions nobody wants to answer. What if Jane Boleyn wasn't a monster? What if she was just a woman trying to survive in the most dangerous court in Europe, making impossible choices where every option led to disaster? What if the real story is so much messier, darker, and more human than the simple villain narrative we've been fed. Because here's what nobody tells you about Tudor history. We desperately need our villains. We crave our monsters. And we especially need female villains. The jealous wives, the scheming ladies-in-waiting, the women who destroy other women. Jane Boleyn has played that role perfectly for 5 centuries. The ultimate toxic in-law. The sister-in-law from hell. But strip away the legend, look at the actual evidence, and something else emerges. Something more complicated, more tragic, more real. A woman navigating a world designed to destroy her. Making choices with limited information and no power. Trying to survive when survival itself was a revolutionary act. So get comfortable. This is going to take a while. Because to understand Jane Boleyn, to really understand her, we need to go deep. Into the court politics of the 1530s and 40s, into the mechanics of how queens fall, into what life was actually like for a woman serving in royal households when one wrong word could mean death. And if you're enjoying this dive into Tudor darkness, subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love seeing our community scattered across time zones, all drawn to the same bloody corners of history. Now dim the lights, maybe grab something to drink, because we're about to spend the next 2 hours with Jane Boleyn, the woman who watched queens die, the woman who might have helped kill them, the woman who ended up on the scaffold herself, speaking carefully chosen final words while the axe waited. Let's start at the real beginning, before the trials, before the executions, before the Boleyn family became the most dangerous name in England. Let's start with a girl named Jane Parker, born into a world of books and prayer and impossible expectations for women. 1505. Maybe 1504. The records don't specify because Jane Parker isn't born important enough for chroniclers to note her arrival precisely. She enters the world at Hallingbury in Essex, the Parker family seat, a manor house, not a palace, comfortable, not extravagant, the kind of place where educated minor nobility raise their children in relative quiet, far from the chaos of court. Her father is Henry Parker. Eventually, he'll become Lord Morley, but in 1505 he's just a scholarly gentleman with more books than money, more opinions than political power. Henry Parker is obsessed with learning in a way that shapes every aspect of his household. His library is enormous for a man of his station. Classical texts, religious treatises, philosophy, poetry, works in Latin, Italian, French. He reads everything, translates works from multiple languages into English, writes moral essays about virtue and Christian conduct. He corresponds with the great humanist thinkers of his age. Erasmus knows his name. Thomas More has read his translations. He's part of that intellectual circle of early Tudor England that believes education can perfect humanity, that classical learning combined with Christian virtue can create better people. It's a beautiful theory, completely impractical for actual Tudor politics, but beautiful. Henry Parker's religious devotion borders on obsessive. He doesn't just attend Mass, he studies theology, debates fine points of doctrine, writes treatises on proper Christian behaviour, and he has very specific ideas about what that means for women. Women, according to Henry Parker's writings, should be modest, silent, obedient. They should submit to their fathers, then their husbands, then their sons if widowed. They should never draw attention to themselves. Never speak unless spoken to. Never express opinions on matters of politics or theology or anything beyond household management. The good woman is the invisible woman. The virtuous woman exists to serve men and bear children, and otherwise disappear. This is the atmosphere Jane grows up in. Every day, every meal, every conversation. Her father's voice explaining why women must be quiet, must be humble, must accept their subordinate position as God's natural order. Her mother, Alice St. John, embodies these principles. She's from a respectable family. The St. Johns have decent connections, go back generations. But Alice herself is a shadow in the historical record. We know almost nothing about her personality, her interests, her thoughts. She existed to manage the household, bear children, and model proper feminine submission. She gives birth to at least 4 children that survive infancy. Jane is the eldest daughter, or possibly second daughter. The birth order isn't entirely clear. There's definitely a sister, Margaret, who'll also serve at court later. Probably brothers too, though they're even less documented than the daughters. The Parker children grow up surrounded by books. This is unusual. Most noble girls learn needlework, music, basic household management, maybe how to read English prayers. That's it. But Henry Parker educates his daughters almost like sons. Jane learns to read. Not just English, but Latin, probably French. She reads classical authors, studies religious texts. Her father believes educated women make better wives to educated men, as long as that education teaches them proper humility. It's a contradiction Henry never resolves. He wants learned daughters but silent ones, women who can read Virgil but never discuss what they've read, ladies who understand theology but never question church doctrine. Jane absorbs this training, learns to be clever quietly, to have opinions while never expressing them, to observe everything while appearing to notice nothing. These skills will save her life multiple times. The Parker household is pious to the point of severity. Daily prayers, regular fasting, constant emphasis on sin and virtue and the afterlife. Jane grows up terrified of hell. Everyone does in this period, but Henry Parker makes sure his children vividly understand the torments awaiting the wicked. Fire, eternal burning, demons with iron hooks pulling your flesh apart forever, screaming that never stops, pain that never dulls, consciousness that never fades. And the wicked, anyone who disobeys God's laws, which means anyone who disobeys their father, their husband, their king. Obedience isn't just virtue, it's spiritual survival. Jane learns to be obedient, outwardly, perfectly obedient. What she thinks privately, she keeps locked away. By her early teens, Jane is exactly what her father wanted to create, educated enough to be interesting, humble enough to be marriageable, pious enough to be respectable. She's quiet, observant, careful with her words. She also has no illusions about her future. She'll be married to whomever her father chooses. She'll bear children if God allows. She'll manage a household. That's the entire scope of possibility for a woman of her class, unless she catches the eye of someone at court, unless her family can leverage their modest connections into a position in a royal household, unless she can enter that glittering, dangerous world where fortunes are made and destroyed on a king's whim. Around 1520 or 1521, when Jane is 15 or 16, the opportunity arrives. Queen Catherine of Aragon needs ladies in waiting. The Parker family has enough connection, through Alice St. John's relatives, through Henry Parker's scholarly reputation, to get Jane considered. Probably money changed hands too. Positions in the Queen's household don't come free. Jane is sent to court. It must be terrifying. She's a teenager from a quiet manor house, thrust into the massive palaces at Greenwich, Richmond, Hampton Court. Thousands of people, elaborate protocols, courtiers who've spent their whole lives mastering the intricate dance of royal favour. One wrong word, one social misstep, one moment of being in the wrong place and you're sent home in disgrace. But Jane has been trained for this. Her father's obsessive emphasis on proper feminine behaviour actually serves her well here. Catherine of Aragon runs a strictly managed household. The Queen is deeply pious, dignified, formal. Her ladies must behave impeccably. No scandals, no impropriety, modest dress, modest behaviour, constant awareness that you represent the Queen's reputation with every word and gesture. Jane fits in perfectly. She knows how to be invisible until needed, how to serve without appearing to seek attention, how to observe without seeming to pry. and court in the early 1520s is still relatively stable. Catherine has been queen for over a decade. She and Henry have one surviving child, Princess Mary, born in 1516. The marriage seems solid, even if the lack of a male heir is worrying. Henry is 30 years old, handsome, athletic. He jousts, hunts, dances, writes music. He's everything a Renaissance king should be. The court revolves around his pleasures, his moods, his favour, and the Boleyn family's already there, already rising, already understanding how to position themselves for power better than almost anyone. Thomas Boleyn, Jane's future father-in-law, is brilliant at court politics. He speaks fluent French, handles delicate diplomatic missions, understands how to navigate between competing factions. He's ambitious in that particularly Tudor way, ruthless but patient, willing to wait years for opportunities. His wife is Elizabeth Howard, daughter of the Duke of Norfolk. This connection to the Howard family is golden. The Howards are one of the most powerful noble families in England, have been for generations. They survived the Wars of the Roses by picking the winning side at crucial moments. Thomas and Elizabeth have 3 children who survived to adulthood: Mary, Anne and George. Mary Boleyn is already at court by 1521. She's been in France, came back around 1520, and almost immediately catches Henry's eye. This is standard practice for ambitious families. Beautiful daughter, put her in the king's path. If he notices her, if she becomes his mistress, the entire family benefits enormously. Mary becomes Henry's mistress probably around 1521 or 1522. The affair is discreet. Mistresses usually are. Everyone knows what's happening, but nobody discusses it directly. That's how court works. Publicly ignore what everyone privately knows. Thomas Boleyn reaps the rewards, new positions, new grants of land, access to the king, the kind of royal favour that can make a family's fortune. Jane, newly arrived at court, watches all this, learns how advancement works, sees which families are rising, which are falling, understands that beauty, charm, and carefully deployed sexuality can change everything for an entire clan. Then Anne Boleyn returns from France, 1522. Anne has spent years in the French Queen's household, absorbing French sophistication. She's maybe 21 years old, not conventionally beautiful. Even people who admire her admit this. Dark hair when blonde is fashionable, thin when curves are preferred. That 6th finger on one hand that enemies will later call a devil's mark. But Anne has something more powerful than beauty. She has presence, style, intelligence, wit that can make men laugh or wince depending on how she aims it. She speaks French like a native, dances beautifully, the French style, more elegant than the heavy English court dances, dresses in French fashions before they're popular in England, commands attention without trying. She's been trained by the French court in the art of courtly love, how to attract men while remaining unattainable, how to flirt without giving in, how to be desirable but just out of reach. It's a performance, and Anne learned from masters. She returns to England for marriage negotiations. She's supposed to marry her cousin, James Butler, an arranged match meant to settle a property dispute between the Boleyn and Butler families. The negotiations drag on for months. While they're dragging, Anne enters Catherine of Aragon's household, starts attending court functions, starts being seen, and Henry notices. This is 1525, 1526. Jane has been at court for several years now. She's in her early 20s, still unmarried, still serving in the Queen's household, still carefully invisible, doing her job, watching everything. She has a front row seat to what happens next. The shift in Henry's attention from Mary Boleyn to Anne Boleyn. The way the king starts looking at Anne. The way Anne deploys every technique the French court taught her. It's masterful and incredibly dangerous. Anne doesn't give in, doesn't become Henry's mistress, holds out, keeps him interested but unsatisfied. It's a calculated risk. If his interest fades, if someone else catches his eye, she loses everything. But if she gives in too soon, she becomes just another discarded mistress once he's bored. So she walks the tightrope, flirts but withdraws, encourages but denies, keeps Henry obsessed by never quite giving him what he wants. By 1526, Henry isn't just interested, he's completely obsessed, and he's starting to seriously worry about the succession. Catherine of Aragon is 41 years old. She hasn't been pregnant in years. Her last pregnancy was back in 1518, a stillborn daughter. Since then, nothing. Her childbearing years are clearly over. Henry has one legitimate child, Princess Mary, a daughter, and England has never successfully been ruled by a queen. Regnant. When they tried, Empress Matilda in the 1100s, it triggered nearly 20 years of civil war that devastated the country. Henry desperately needs a son. The Tudor dynasty is barely 40 years old. Henry's father took the throne by conquest, won it on Bosworth Field by killing Richard III in battle. The claim is shaky, based on victory, not unquestionable hereditary right. If Henry dies without a male heir, England could tear itself apart in succession wars. Every nobleman with a drop of Plantagenet blood might claim the throne. The Wars of the Roses could start all over again, and this time there might not be a clear winner for generations. So Henry starts thinking, what if the marriage to Catherine was never valid? What if God has been punishing him all these years, with dead babies and no sons, because the marriage violated divine law? Catherine was married to Arthur first, Henry's older brother. Arthur died after a few months of marriage. Henry then married Catherine with a papal dispensation, allowing him to marry his brother's widow, despite biblical prohibitions. But Leviticus says clearly, "You shall not uncover the nakedness of your brother's wife. It's an abomination." The punishment is childlessness. Henry decides Leviticus is the relevant passage, that his marriage to Catherine violated God's law, that all these years of stillbirths and dead infants are divine punishment for living in sin. He wants an annulment, wants the Pope to declare the marriage was never valid. Then he can marry someone else, someone who can give him sons, someone like Anne Boleyn. This sets off what becomes known as the King's Great Matter, a political and religious crisis that will eventually tear England away from Rome, establish Henry as supreme head of the Church of England, and reshape the entire country. But that's the big political story. We're focused on Jane. Because while all this is happening, while Henry is pursuing Anne, while the annulment crisis is building, while court politics are becoming increasingly dangerous, Jane Parker is getting married. Sometime in 1524 or 1525, Jane marries George Boleyn. George is Thomas and Elizabeth's youngest child, an only son. Born around 1504 or 1505, making him about Jane's age, somewhere in his early 20s when they wed. By every account, George is extraordinarily talented. Handsome, this gets mentioned repeatedly in contemporary sources. Tall, athletic, good at jousting, hunting, all the physical pursuits that matter at court. But he's not just a pretty face with sword skills. George is educated, reads Latin and French fluently, writes poetry that survives in manuscript collections, understands theology well enough to debate it with scholars. He's part of that humanist circle, like Jane's father, that believes education and virtue can elevate humanity. He's also charming, witty, the kind of person who lights up a room when he enters. People genuinely like him, not just because he's well connected, but because he's good company. Henry VIII likes him, genuinely. The king is paranoid and unpredictable with almost everyone, but he trusts George Boleyn, sends him on diplomatic missions to France, includes him in private councils, values his opinion on everything from theology to foreign policy to court entertainment. On paper, Jane Parker has made an excellent match. George Boleyn is from a rising family. He's talented, connected, personally favoured by the king. Their marriage should launch Jane into the upper ranks of court society. The wedding probably happens at court, ceremony in the chapel, followed by a feast. Jane's father, Henry Parker, surely approves. The Boleyns are exactly the kind of family he'd want his daughter connected to. Ambitious, but educated. Rising in power, but also intellectually respectable. The marriage itself creates important connections. Jane's family and the Boleyn family are now linked. The Parkers gain association with the Boleyn's rising star. The Boleyns gain connection to the Parker family's scholarly reputation and St. John relatives. Everyone benefits, in theory. So why do historians insist for 500 years that it was a miserable marriage? Simple. They need it to be. Because if Jane and George were happy together, or even just neutral about each other, cordially coexisting like most noble couples, then why would Jane destroy him? Why would she testify against him? Why would she help send him to his death? The vindictive, jealous wife narrative requires a terrible marriage. So historians looked at the evidence, which is almost non-existent, and filled in the gaps with whatever made their story work. Here's what we actually know about Jane and George's marriage. They never had children. That's it. That's literally the only concrete fact about their relationship that survives in the historical record. No children. In 11 or 12 years of marriage, in an era where noble couples were expected to produce heirs, where childlessness was seen as a sign of divine disfavour or biological defect. From this one fact, historians have built elaborate theories. Theory 1. George was homosexual. The marriage was never consummated. Jane knew and resented being a beard for his true preferences. Evidence? Basically none. An accusation of sodomy appears in some later accounts of his trial. Not in the official indictment, not in contemporary trial records, just in chronicles written years later by hostile sources who had every reason to make the Boleyns look depraved. In Tudor England, calling a dead man a sodomite was easy character assassination. Doesn't mean it was true. Theory 2. George was a compulsive adulterer. He humiliated Jane publicly by flaunting affairs with other women, making her a laughingstock at court. Evidence? Even thinner. Court was full of sexual intrigue. Everyone was probably having affairs with everyone. Else that was just Tudor court culture. But specific evidence that George was notably worse than any other courtier? That he specifically humiliated Jane? None. Theory 3. The marriage was unconsummated due to some physical problem. Impotence on his side. Some physical barrier on hers. Mutual repulsion, whatever. Evidence? Pure speculation. Zero documentation. The childlessness could mean anything. Infertility on either side. Repeated miscarriages that went unrecorded. A marriage that was consummated but irregularly. Medical issues, just bad luck. Tudor medicine had no understanding of ovulation, no fertility treatments, no way to diagnose reproductive problems. Childless couples were just cursed by God in their minds. Nobody investigated why. Here's what else might explain the childlessness. Jane and George spent a lot of time apart. He was constantly on diplomatic missions. She served in the Queen's household. They might not have been in the same location often enough to conceive. That's boring but plausible. Or maybe they did conceive. Maybe Jane had early miscarriages that nobody recorded because first trimester losses weren't considered unusual or noteworthy. Maybe she had stillbirths that got documented somewhere and the records didn't survive. But historians don't like boring explanations or missing evidence. They like drama. So they invented a miserable marriage to explain why Jane would betray George. Except there's no contemporary evidence the marriage was particularly bad. No letters survive where Jane complains about George. No courtiers record public fights or dramatic scenes. No ambassadors mention the Rochford marriage being scandalous. The silence is total, which suggests either they were reasonably content together, or at least professionally cordial, putting on a united front, or their problems were private enough that nobody thought to record them. So let's put aside the speculation about their marriage and look at what we know Jane was actually doing in these years. By 1529, the king's great matter has consumed English politics. Henry has been trying to get his marriage annulled for 3 years. The Pope refuses. Catherine of Aragon refuses to cooperate. It's become an international crisis. Anne Boleyn is still holding out, still refusing to sleep with Henry, keeping him desperate by promising everything but delivering nothing until he makes her his wife. It's brilliant strategy, but incredibly dangerous. The longer it goes on, the more enemies Anne makes. Catherine's supporters hate her. The old noble families resent the upstart Boleyns. Clergy who oppose the annulment see her as a homewrecker, destroying the church's authority. Jane watches all this from her position in the Queen's household. She's close to it, sees the strain on Catherine, who's fighting desperately to save her marriage and her daughter's legitimacy, sees the tension every time Henry and Catherine are in the same room. Increasingly, rare as Henry just avoids his wife entirely. Jane also sees Anne, because Anne is at court constantly now, even though she's not yet queen. She has her own household, her own chambers. She dines publicly with Henry. Everyone can see where this is heading. In 1532, Henry gives up on papal approval. He's going to do this himself. Break from Rome if necessary. Become supreme head of the church in England. Declare his own marriage invalid and marry Anne without the Pope's blessing. It's revolutionary, unprecedented. It will reshape English religion, politics and culture for centuries. But Henry doesn't care. He wants Anne, he wants sons, and he's done waiting for Rome's permission. In January 1533, Anne finally sleeps with Henry. After 7 years of pursuit, 7 years of him moving heaven and earth to have her, she gets pregnant immediately. Or maybe she was already pregnant, and that's why she finally gave in. The timeline is suspicious enough that historians still argue about it. They marry secretly in January 1533. The marriage is announced publicly in May. Anne is visibly pregnant by then. Everyone can see the swelling belly beneath her gowns. She's crowned queen in June 1533. Elaborate coronation ceremony. Procession through London. Streets decorated with pageants celebrating the new queen. The whole spectacle designed to prove that Anne is now queen, legitimate, anointed by God, and anyone who questions it is committing treason. Jane Boleyn is there for all of it. She's been transferred from Catherine of Aragon's household, which is being systematically dismantled, to Anne Boleyn's household. This is a promotion, a huge one. She's now serving the Queen of England, her sister-in-law, the woman her husband's family pushed into the highest position in the country. What does Jane think about all this? The records don't tell us. She doesn't leave letters expressing her opinion about Anne becoming queen. Doesn't write in a diary about how it feels to serve her husband's sister. But she's right at the centre of power now. Her husband's father, Thomas Boleyn, is Earl of Wiltshire and one of the king's closest advisors. Her husband George is Viscount Rochford, constantly in the king's presence, trusted with sensitive missions. The Boleyns have arrived. They're at the absolute pinnacle of power. Everyone who opposed them has been pushed aside, silenced, or destroyed. Catherine of Aragon has been banished from court. Her household broken up. Her daughter Mary declared illegitimate. The old queen is sick, isolated, denied access to her child. She'll die in lonely exile in 3 years. The Boleyn family controls access to the king, influences policy, enriches themselves enormously through grants and positions. And it all depends on one thing: Anne producing a male heir. On September 7th, 1533, Anne gives birth, after months of pregnancy. Elaborate preparations. Prayers for a son. Astrologers predicting the baby will be male. Documents already prepared announcing the birth of a prince. It's a girl, Elizabeth. The disappointment is crushing. You can feel it in the records. The announcements declaring the birth of a prince have to be hastily altered. An extra S squeezed in to make princess. The letters notifying foreign courts are delayed while new versions are written. Henry had been so certain. He'd told everyone the baby would be male, broken with Rome for this, destroyed his first marriage for this, convinced himself that God was blessing this union with sons. A daughter suggests God might not be blessing it after all. But okay, it's the first child. Anne is young, maybe 26. There's time. The next one will be male, has to be, except the pressure is unbearable now. Because Henry destroyed his relationship with Rome, declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, made enemies across Catholic Europe, all so he could marry Anne and get a male heir. If Anne can't deliver sons, then what was the point? Jane watches this pressure building, sees the strain on Anne, sees how careful Anne has to be now, how every miscarriage, every month without pregnancy, every time her courses come, brings visible disappointment from the king. By 1534, Anne is pregnant again. Everyone holds their breath. This time. Surely this time it'll be a boy. Miscarriage. Somewhere around the 3rd or 4th month. The details aren't recorded clearly. Early miscarriages often weren't, unless they were politically significant. But it's politically significant now. That's 2 pregnancies, 1 daughter, 1 early loss, no sons, 1535. Another pregnancy. This one makes it further. Past the dangerous early months, everyone's hoping again, praying. Anne is being careful, staying off her feet, avoiding stress, doing everything medieval medicine thinks helps pregnancy. And then on January 29th, 1536, the same day they're holding Catherine of Aragon's funeral, Anne miscarries again. This time, the chroniclers record details because it matters politically. The fetus was far enough along to be recognisably formed. Most sources say it was male. Some describe it as deformed. Reports vary on how deformed. Some say relatively normal. Some say grotesquely malformed. Some say you could tell it was male. Others say you couldn't. What we know, it was recognisably a fetus, not just a mass of tissue. It was far enough along for Anne to be devastated. And it happened on the exact day they buried Catherine of Aragon. The symbolism is inescapable. Catherine dies and miscarries, like God is making a point about which marriage he actually blessed. Anne is 34 or 35. She's been queen for less than 3 years. 1 daughter, multiple miscarriages, no sons. And Henry is already looking elsewhere. Jane Seymour. She's one of Anne's own ladies-in-waiting. Pale, blonde, quiet. Everything Anne isn't. The complete opposite of the sharp-tongued, opinionated, dark-haired woman Henry moved heaven and earth to marry. By early 1536, everyone at court can see where this is going. Henry is courting Jane Seymour, sending her gifts, spending time with her, making it obvious that Anne's days are numbered. Jane Boleyn sees all this. She's in Anne's household, watches the Queen trying to maintain composure while her marriage collapses. Watches Henry's attention shift just like it shifted from Catherine to Anne years ago. History repeating. Except this time, Anne knows what happens to discarded wives. Here's Henry's problem. He can't just divorce Anne. He broke with Rome to marry her. If he admits the marriage was a mistake, if he has it annulled, what does that say about everything he did to make it happen? It means admitting he was wrong. That maybe God wasn't blessing this union after all. That Princess Elizabeth is illegitimate. That he destroyed England's relationship with the Catholic Church for nothing. His ego can't handle that. The political ramifications would be catastrophic. So divorce isn't an option, which leaves only one alternative. If Anne dies, if she's convicted of treason and executed, then Henry can remarry with a clear conscience, can claim he was deceived, that Anne betrayed him, that her failure to produce sons was divine punishment for her wickedness, not his poor judgment. The question isn't whether Anne will fall, it's how quickly Cromwell can build the case. Thomas Cromwell is Henry's chief minister now, the man who made the break from Rome happen, who dissolved the monasteries and enriched both the crown and himself enormously, who understands power better than almost anyone in England. And Cromwell has a problem with Anne Boleyn. She's been opposing his foreign policy, arguing with him in council about how monastery wealth should be distributed, making herself politically dangerous to him. More than that, Cromwell understands what Henry wants, even before Henry fully admits it to himself. The king wants Anne gone, wants to marry Jane Seymour, needs it to happen in a way that doesn't make him look weak or wrong or indecisive. Cromwell decides to give the king what he wants. In April 1536, he begins building a case, carefully, methodically. He needs evidence of treason. And for a queen, treason means adultery, because if Anne had sex with other men, any children she produces might not be the king's. She could introduce false heirs into the succession, cuckold the king, undermine the entire basis of royal legitimacy. That's treason. The penalty is death. Cromwell starts with the most vulnerable person at court, Mark Smeaton. Smeaton is a musician, plays the virginals beautifully, talented enough that the king enjoys his performances. He's low-born, son of a carpenter, risen entirely through musical talent and personal charm. He has no powerful family to protect him, no connections that matter, no one who'll fight for him if he's accused. He's perfect. On April 30th, 1536, Smeaton is arrested, taken to Cromwell's house in Stepney, away from the court, away from witnesses. What happens there isn't recorded in detail, but when Smeaton emerges, he's confessed to adultery with Queen Anne. Was he tortured? Cromwell denies it later, says Smeaton confessed freely. But Cromwell is a practiced liar, and torture was technically illegal without royal warrant. But there are ways to hurt someone without leaving marks, ways to terrify someone into confession, sleep deprivation, threats of what will happen to him and his family if he doesn't cooperate. Psychological pressure applied expertly. Or maybe Cromwell promised him his life, told him confess and implicate others, and you'll be spared. Just tell us what happened and we'll show mercy, Smeaton confesses, says he and Anne had a sexual relationship. Names, times, places, gives Cromwell exactly what he needs. It doesn't save him, but he doesn't know that yet. Once Cromwell has Smeaton's confession, he moves fast, needs more names, more men, a pattern of behaviour that makes Anne look not just unfaithful, but monstrously depraved. The men he chooses are telling. They're not random courtiers, they're people close to the king, people whose destruction will send a message. May 1st, 1536. May Day. There's a tournament at Greenwich. Henry and Anne attend together. Everything appears normal. Henry Norris jousts. George Boleyn is there. The court watches, applauds, drinks, flirts. And that evening, Henry suddenly leaves. Just gets up and rides back to Whitehall with only a handful of attendants. Leaves Anne behind without explanation, without farewell, without any of the ceremony that usually surrounds a king's movements. Anne knows immediately that something is catastrophically wrong. The king doesn't just leave tournaments in the middle, not without reason, not without telling the queen. She must spend that night in terror, knowing something has gone wrong, but not what, not how bad it is, not whether she's about to be arrested or if she can somehow talk her way out of whatever's happening. The next morning, May 2nd, Anne is arrested. They come for her at Greenwich, take her by barge down the Thames, through Traitor's Gate. That water entrance every prisoner knows means you're probably not coming out alive. The same morning they arrest Henry Norris. Norris is one of Henry's closest personal servants, groom of the stool, the man who helps the king with his most intimate bodily functions. That position requires absolute trust. You're in the king's private chambers. You see him vulnerable, sick, naked. You have access no one else has. Henry trusted Norris completely. For years, the charge, adultery with Queen Anne. Norris denies it, absolutely, completely denies it. They offer him his life if he'll confess. He refuses, maintains his innocence, knowing it means death. They arrest Francis Weston, young courtier, from a good family, married, known for being charming and reckless with money, accused of adultery with the Queen. He denies it too. William Brereton, powerful courtier with extensive lands in Cheshire, connected family, accused of adultery, denies it. And George Boleyn, Anne's brother, Jane's husband, Viscount Rochford, one of the king's favourite courtiers. George is arrested May 2nd, same day as Anne, taken to the Tower, locked in a cell while Cromwell completes his case. And here's where the incest accusation enters the story, the charge that will define the case. The accusation, so shocking it overshadows everything else. George Boleyn didn't just commit adultery with the Queen. According to the indictment, he committed incest with his own sister. This is designed to horrify, to make the entire Boleyn family seem cursed, demonic, unnatural. Incest is the ultimate taboo, the crime that proves you're not just criminal, but monstrous. It's also almost certainly fabricated. Think about the mechanics. Anne and George are siblings, raised together. They're close. Siblings at court often are. They rely on each other politically, trust each other in ways they can't trust anyone else. Anne could confide in George about things she couldn't tell anyone else. He was blood, family. The one person at court who wasn't there because of what he could get from her, but because they shared parents, shared childhood, shared the experience of rising from minor nobility to the heights of power. But the jump from close siblings who trust each other to committing incest requires evidence, real concrete evidence, and according to tradition, that evidence comes from Jane. Here's the story we've been told for 500 years. Jane Boleyn testified against her husband and sister-in-law. She told Cromwell's investigators that George and Anne spent too much time alone together, that their relationship seemed sexual, that she witnessed or suspected something unnatural happening behind closed doors. This story first appears in the reports of Eustace Chapuis, the imperial ambassador. He writes to Emperor Charles V that Lady Rochford gave testimony against her husband. But Chapuis isn't in the courtroom. He's not a witness to the trials. He's getting his information second-hand, third-hand, filtered through diplomatic gossip and political intelligence gathering. And he hates the Boleyns, absolutely despises them. He's been Catherine of Aragon's advocate for years. He's dedicated to Anne's destruction and Princess Mary's restoration to the succession. His reports are useful historical sources, but they're also propaganda. He has every reason to make the Boleyns look as terrible as possible, to paint Anne as a whore, George as a degenerate, and the whole family as morally corrupt. So when Chapuis reports that Lady Rochford testified, we need to ask, is this true? Or is this what he wants to believe? What fits his narrative? The actual trial records that survive don't name Jane Boleyn specifically, don't include her testimony verbatim, don't confirm definitively that she testified at all. What they show: George Boleyn was accused of incest with his sister based on evidence that he spent time alone with Anne in her chambers, that they had private conversations, that their relationship appeared closer than normal siblings. But Anne and George were siblings. Of course they spent time together. Of course they had private conversations. That's normal family behaviour, especially at court where political alliances and family loyalty were everything. Someone had to make that normal behaviour look sinister, had to testify that the time they spent together crossed a line, that something unnatural was happening. Did Jane provide that testimony? Maybe. The historical sources suggest she might have, but the evidence is thin and comes from hostile witnesses with clear agendas. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that she did testify, that Cromwell's agents came to her and she told them something about George and Anne's relationship that was used as evidence. Why would she do that? Here's the question historians never adequately answer. What does Jane gain? If she testifies, she knows what happens. George will be convicted, he'll be executed, the entire Boleyn family will be destroyed. She'll be left alone, widowed, tainted by association with traitors. What's her reward for this betrayal? Traditional answer: revenge. She hated Anne for being beautiful and powerful. She resented George for whatever reasons: neglect, affairs, homosexuality, cruelty. She wanted to watch them burn. But that requires Jane to be monumentally stupid, because destroying the Boleyn family destroys her own position. She's Lady Rochford because she's married to George. If George dies a convicted traitor, she loses everything. She doesn't gain power, she doesn't gain wealth, she doesn't gain position. She loses. So why testify? Here's an alternative theory. She was forced to. Imagine you're Jane Boleyn in early May 1536. Your sister-in-law has been arrested. Your husband has been arrested. 4 other men are in the Tower on charges of adultery with the Queen. The case is being built. Cromwell needs evidence. And someone, Cromwell himself, or one of his agents, comes to you. They're not asking. They're telling. They need your testimony. Need you to confirm certain details about George and Anne's relationship, about how much time they spent alone, about whether anything you saw suggested impropriety. You know what they want you to say. You know that saying it will doom George. But you also know what happens if you refuse. Refusing to cooperate with a royal investigation is itself suspicious. You're obstructing justice, protecting traitors. And in Henry VIII's England, that makes you complicit. That puts you on the scaffold next to them. Your choices are: tell them what they want to hear and maybe survive, or refuse and definitely die alongside your husband. What would you do? Put yourself in her position. Actually imagine it. You're 31 years old. Your husband has been arrested for treason. You have no powerful family to protect you. The Parkers are respectable, but not politically powerful. Your father can't save you. You're summoned before Cromwell's agents. They tell you they're investigating treasonous behaviour. They ask you questions about George and Anne, about their relationship, about things you might have seen. They're not asking if George is guilty. They're telling you he's guilty, and they need your confirmation. If you say, "I never saw anything suspicious," you're calling them liars. You're suggesting the investigation is baseless. That's dangerous, potentially fatal. If you say, "I don't remember," or "I prefer not to say," you're being uncooperative, suspicious. Why wouldn't a loyal subject help uncover treason? Unless you're protecting traitors. If you say what they want to hear, yes, they spent time alone together. Yes, it seemed closer than normal siblings. Yes, I thought it was odd. You survive, maybe, for now. Those are your options. All of them terrible, none of them good. Jane chose survival. If she testified, and remember, we're not entirely certain she did, she chose to tell Cromwell what he wanted to hear rather than die with the Boleyns. Can you blame her? Here's another possibility that never gets discussed. Maybe Jane didn't testify at all. Maybe the whole story is fabricated, historical gossip that hardened into fact through repetition. Because Chapuis says Lady Rochford testified. But he's not there. He's reporting rumours. Later, chronicles mention it, but they're writing years or decades later, getting their information from earlier sources, from oral tradition, from politically motivated accounts. The actual trial records that survive, fragmentary, incomplete, don't definitively confirm Jane's testimony. Maybe she was questioned. Maybe she gave some statement. Maybe that statement was twisted into something more than it was. Maybe Cromwell used her name without her consent, claimed she testified when she hadn't. Because the wife says sounds more damning than we assume. The truth is lost, buried under 5 centuries of assumptions and narrative convenience. What we know for certain: George Boleyn was tried on May 15th, 1536. The trial was held in the Tower. A jury of 26 peers heard the evidence. The charges: adultery with the Queen, incest with his sister, treason. George defended himself brilliantly. He spoke eloquently, dismantled the prosecution's case point by point, showed the logical flaws, pointed out the lack of credible evidence, questioned the reliability of Smeaton's confession. There was a moment during the trial that everyone remembered. They handed George a piece of paper with an accusation written on it, something Anne had supposedly said about the king, probably that Henry was impotent. The judges wanted him to just confirm he'd seen it without reading it aloud. George read it aloud anyway, to the entire court. Whatever was on that paper, probably Anne saying the king couldn't perform sexually, George made sure everyone heard it. It was a deliberate choice, a middle finger to the prosecution. If they were going to execute him on false charges, he was going to humiliate the king on the way out. People who witnessed the trial said George defended himself so well that if the verdict weren't predetermined, he might have been acquitted. But the verdict was predetermined. This was Henry VIII. When the king wanted you dead, you died. The trial was theatre. The outcome was decided before George ever entered the room. The jury convicted him. All 26 peers voted guilty. The sentence? Death. The full traitor's death, hanged, castrated, disemboweled while still alive, then beheaded. 4 other men were convicted the same day. Norris, Weston, Brereton, Smeaton, all sentenced to death. 2 days later, on May 17th, the sentences were carried out. Well, modified, Henry showed mercy by commuting the sentences to simple beheading. No disemboweling, no castration, no being cut down from the rope, while still breathing to watch your own intestines pulled out. Just the axe, relatively quick, relatively clean, still brutal, still public, still designed to send a message to anyone watching. The execution is at Tower Hill. Not inside the tower. That's reserved for people of the highest rank. Tower Hill is public, open, thousands can watch. They build a scaffold specially. Fresh wood, wide enough for the condemned man to kneel and the executioner to work, tall enough that the crowd can see. Thousands gather, packed so tight you can barely move. Vendors selling pies, ale, roasted nuts, children on shoulders, people jostling for better views. Death as public entertainment. A morning's diversion before the city goes back to work. The condemned men are brought out one at a time. The sources don't specify the exact order. Probably Smeaton first. Lowest rank goes first. Then the nobles in order of precedence. Each man gives a speech. It's expected, required really. You admit your guilt vaguely, ask forgiveness, urge everyone to live virtuously and obey the king. George's speech is careful, masterful even. He admits to general sinfulness. Everyone does that, it's formulaic. Says he deserves death for his offences against God and king, but he doesn't confess to the specific charges. Doesn't admit to adultery or incest. Just vague acknowledgement that he's a sinner like all men. That God's judgment is righteous. That everyone should learn from his example and live in virtue. It's saying nothing while appearing to say everything. It's satisfying the form without actually admitting guilt. And then he kneels, places his head on the block. The wood is stained dark from previous executions. Blood soaks into wood, never quite washes clean. The executioner raises the axe. It's heavy, 8 pounds of sharpened steel on a 4-foot handle. Executioners train for years to be accurate, to make it quick. The axe falls, 1 stroke. George Boleyn's head separates from his body. Blood sprays from the severed neck. The head rolls onto the straw scattered on the scaffold to absorb blood. The body jerks, nerve impulses firing randomly, then goes still. The crowd roars. Some people cheer, some cross themselves, some turn away, faces green. They wrap George's body in cloth, his head too, everything into a plain coffin, nothing fancy. Traitors don't get elaborate funerals. 4 more times that morning the axe falls. 4 more heads, 4 more bodies wrapped and carried away. By mid-morning, all 5 men are dead. The tower guns fire. The boom echoes across London. Official announcement that the executions are complete. Jane Boleyn is a widow at 31 years old. Her husband is dead. Beheaded as a traitor. His titles are forfeited. His lands are confiscated. His name is permanently stained with accusations of incest and treason. And Jane, whether she testified or not, whether she had a choice or not, has to live with it. 2 days later, Anne Boleyn follows her brother to the scaffold. Anne is beheaded on May 19th, 1536. Inside the tower, not on Tower Hill, a small concession to her former rank as queen. The scaffold is built on Tower Green, a relatively private space, maybe 50 witnesses instead of thousands. Henry's council members, foreign ambassadors, a few nobles, Anne's ladies including possibly Jane, though the records don't specify who exactly attended. The executioner has been brought from France. A swordsman, not an axeman, specially commissioned because he's supposed to be the best, clean, quick, merciful. Anne's last speech is brief, graceful even. She doesn't protest her innocence. That would be treason in itself, questioning the king's justice. But she doesn't confess either. She says she's ready to die. That she commits her soul to God. She asks everyone to pray for the king, says he's been a good and gracious lord to her. It's carefully calibrated, saying just enough to satisfy form without actually admitting guilt. She kneels, blindfolded. Her ladies tie the cloth around her eyes. She prays quietly in French, repeating the same phrase over and over. Jésus, receive my soul. O Lord God, have pity on my soul. The swordsman is standing to the side. He pretends to move, getting her to turn her head slightly to the left. Then he strikes from the right, while she's distracted. One stroke. The sword cuts through her neck cleanly. Her head separates from her body and rolls onto the straw. According to witnesses, her lips keep moving for several seconds after. The mouth opening and closing, muscles still firing, the brain not quite realizing it's been separated from the body. They wrap her in cloth. No coffin was prepared. Nobody thought to order one. So they shove her body into an old elm chest that used to hold bow staves. Arrow supplies. It's the only container available. They bury her in the Tower Chapel. St. Peter ad vincula. No ceremony, no prayers, no monument, just a body in the floor. Anne Boleyn, Queen of England for 3 years, is dead at 35. And Jane Boleyn has survived. This is where the traditional story says Jane prospers, gets rewarded for her betrayal, receives lands and favour, and returns to court triumphant, proof that she helped destroy the Boleyns and benefited from it. Here's what actually happens. Jane gets some of George's lands back, but this isn't a reward, it's standard dower rights. Widows in noble families were legally entitled to a portion of their dead husband's property. It was basic medieval inheritance law. You couldn't strip widows of their dower without cause, even if their husbands died as traitors. The lands Jane gets are minimal, a few manors, enough income to live on modestly. Not wealth, not power, just survival money. She's not showered with royal favour, not given positions at court, not visibly rewarded by Henry. Instead, she essentially disappears from the historical record. For the next several years, from 1536 to about 1540, Jane Boleyn is almost invisible in contemporary sources. No court appearances that get documented, no letters that survive, no chroniclers mentioning her. She's lying low, being invisible, waiting for the scandal to fade. This makes sense. The Boleyn name is poison. Anyone associated with the family is suspect. Thomas Boleyn, George's father, loses most of his positions. He's not executed. Henry shows that much mercy, but he's politically destroyed. He retreats to his estates and dies in 1539, broken and forgotten. Jane is tainted by association. She's Lady Rochford, wife of a convicted traitor. Even if people believe she testified against him, that doesn't make her a hero. It makes her a woman who betrayed her husband, which isn't exactly admirable in Tudor eyes, so she keeps her head down, lives quietly on her dower lands, stays away from court, waits for people to forget or at least stop caring. Meanwhile, the court moves on with breathtaking speed. Henry marries Jane Seymour 11 days after Anne's execution. 11 days. Barely time to bury one wife before taking another. Jane Seymour is everything Anne wasn't. Pale, blonde, quiet. She doesn't argue with Henry, doesn't express political opinions, doesn't challenge him. She's pliable, submissive, safe, and she gives Henry what he wants. On October 12th, 1537, Jane Seymour gives birth to a son. Edward, the long-awaited male heir, the child Henry broke with Rome to obtain, the boy who will one day, briefly, be Edward VI. The entire kingdom celebrates, bonfires, church bells, public thanksgiving. After years of disappointments and dead babies and political chaos, finally, Henry has a legitimate son. Jane Seymour dies 12 days later. Puerperal fever, childbed fever, the bacterial infection that kills so many women in this era. Streptococcus getting into the uterus during or after birth, spreading through the bloodstream, causing fever, sepsis, death. There's no treatment, no antibiotics. You just watch the woman burn with fever, convulse with pain, and die. Jane Seymour is buried with full honours. Henry genuinely mourns her, wears black for months, calls her his only true wife, the one who gave him his son. He'll ask to be buried beside her when he dies. The court continues. Henry needs to marry again. He's only got one son, needs more heirs to secure the succession. Political negotiations begin for a fourth wife. This is the world Jane Boleyn is living through, from 1536 to 1540. Watching from a distance, reading news from court, seeing queens rise and fall with terrifying speed. She's survived the destruction of the Boleyns, but she has no power, no position, no security until she gets a second chance. By 1540, Jane has worked her way back to court. How exactly this happens, the records don't tell us. But by the time Henry marries his fourth wife, Anne of Cleves, in January 1540, Jane is back. She's appointed to Anne of Cleves' household, not a senior position, not head lady-in-waiting, but she's there, back in the system. This is remarkable when you think about it. Jane Boleyn, widow of a man executed for incest and treason, has successfully rehabilitated her reputation enough to serve a queen again. How? Probably through her father's connections. Henry Parker, Lord Morley by now, is still respected in scholarly circles. He's not politically powerful, but he has connections, can vouch for his daughter, can ask favours from people who owe him. Probably also because Jane is good at her job. She's been serving in Queen's households since 1520. 20 years of experience. She knows the protocols better than almost anyone. Knows how court works, how to navigate the politics, how to serve without causing trouble. She's valuable, experienced, discreet, exactly what a new queen needs. Anne of Cleves' marriage is a disaster from the start. Henry finds her unattractive, can't or won't consummate the marriage, wants out immediately. The marriage is annulled by July 1540, 6 months. Anne agrees to everything, gets a generous settlement, and becomes the king's beloved sister. She lives quite comfortably for the rest of her life. She's smart enough not to fight Henry, just accepts the annulment, takes her estates, and survives. Jane Boleyn is part of Anne's household for those 6 months, witnesses another failed royal marriage, another queen who doesn't last, and then comes Catherine Howard. This is where Jane's story picks up again, with momentum, where she makes choices that will destroy her just as thoroughly as the first set of choices, or non-choices or forced choices, destroyed her husband. Catherine Howard is 17 years old when Henry marries her, maybe younger, maybe as young as 15. Her birth date isn't certain, somewhere between 1521 and 1525, depending on which sources you trust. She's Anne Boleyn's first cousin, both granddaughters of Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk. The Howard family, having learned nothing from Anne Boleyn's destruction, is trying the same strategy again. Pretty young woman, put her in front of the king, hope he falls in love, reap the political benefits. But Catherine isn't Anne. Not even close. Anne was educated, sophisticated, politically savvy. Anne understood what she was doing, the risks she was taking, the game she was playing. Catherine is a teenager with almost no education, no political training, and a sexual history that would horrify Henry if he knew about it. Let's talk about Catherine's background. Because to understand why she makes the catastrophically stupid choices she makes, you need to understand where she came from. Catherine is raised primarily at Lambeth. Her step-grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, runs a kind of boarding house for young women from the Howard family and their connections. Dozens of girls and women living together, sleeping in shared dormitories, minimal adult supervision. The Dowager Duchess is old, doesn't pay much attention to what her charges are doing. It's chaotic. Young women gossiping, flirting, sneaking boys into the dormitories, music teachers and male servants having inappropriate relationships with teenage girls. A perfect recipe for scandal. Catherine grows up in this environment, no parents watching her. They're dead or distant or uninterested. No one teaching her discretion. No one explaining that her behaviour now could destroy her future. When she's maybe 12 or 13, she begins music lessons with Henry Mannix. He teaches virginals and singing. He's an adult man in a position of authority, and he begins a sexual relationship with Catherine. In modern terms, this is clear abuse. Catherine is a child, 12 or 13 years old. Mannix is an adult with power over her. She cannot meaningfully consent to this relationship. But in Tudor times, the lines are blurrier. Girls are considered marriageable at 12. Sexual activity among teenagers isn't particularly unusual or scandalous unless pregnancy results. Still, the Mannix situation is inappropriate, even by Tudor standards. He's a servant. She's nobility. The class difference alone makes it scandalous. If discovered, Mannix could be severely punished. Eventually, someone does notice. The relationship ends, or maybe just becomes more discreet. The timeline is unclear, but Catherine has learned something. Sex is pleasurable. Men desire her. Her body gives her power in a world where women have almost no other power. Then comes Francis, Dereham. Dereham is part of the household at Lambeth. He's connected to the Howards, though not closely. Charming, ambitious, reckless. He and Catherine begin a full sexual relationship. This isn't furtive groping like with Mannix. This is regular intercourse. Dereham visits Catherine's bed at night. Her roommates know. They sleep in the same room. He brings her gifts. They call each other husband and wife. By Tudor law, this could constitute a valid marriage, no ceremony required. If two people exchange vows, even privately, and then consummate the relationship, that can be legally binding. Catherine is maybe 15 or 16. Dereham is in his mid-20s. They're sleeping together regularly, planning to marry formally eventually. Her roommates know. Some of the other women in the household know. Nobody tells the Dowager Duchess or anyone else in authority because nobody thinks it matters. Catherine is just another teenager having sex before marriage. Hardly unusual. Then Catherine's prospects change dramatically. The Howard family gets her a position at court. First in Anne of Cleves' household, then when that marriage collapses, in the new household being formed for whoever Henry marries next. Catherine goes to court probably in late 1539 or early 1540. She's maybe 17. She's pretty. She knows how to flirt. She catches attention, and she leaves Dereham behind. Their relationship ends, or doesn't officially end, which will become a problem later. At court, Catherine catches the king's eye. Henry is 49 years old, grotesquely fat. His waist measures 54 inches by this point. His leg ulcer is weeping infected pus constantly. The smell is terrible. He's in chronic pain, can barely walk without assistance. His mood swings are legendary. One moment jovial, the next screaming with rage over minor offences, executing people for perceived slights. And Catherine is this tiny, pretty teenager who giggles at his jokes and makes him feel young again. The courtship is swift. By July 1540 they're married. Catherine is queen, and Jane Boleyn is appointed to her household. Why would the Howard family want Jane Boleyn serving Catherine? On the surface, it seems risky. Jane's name is attached to Anne Boleyn's fall. Her husband died accused of incest. She's connected to scandal. But Jane has advantages that outweigh the risk. She's experienced, 20 years serving queens. She knows the protocols better than almost anyone at court. She's mature, in her mid-30s now, while most ladies in waiting are teenagers or early 20s. She can provide guidance. She's careful, discreet, has navigated dangerous situations before and survived. She's family, sort of. Jane's sister-in-law Anne was Catherine's cousin. There's a connection there, however distant. The Howard family thinks Jane will be useful, a steadying influence on an inexperienced teenage queen. They're catastrophically wrong. For about a year, everything appears fine. Catherine plays the role of queen adequately. She attends state functions, smiles and looks pretty, wears elaborate gowns, gives Henry the appearance of youth and vitality he desperately craves. But privately, Catherine is miserable. She's 17 years old, married to a man old enough to be her grandfather, a man whose body is rotting, who smells of infected flesh, and can barely move without pain, who's unpredictable and terrifying. Henry's sexual performance is probably minimal. Between his age, his obesity, his infected leg, and possible diabetes or other medical issues, he likely can't maintain erections consistently. The marriage bed is probably humiliating for both of them. Catherine is trapped. She has everything a woman is supposed to want: crown, jewels, power, wealth, and she's utterly miserable. Then she encounters Thomas Culpeper, or re-encounters him. They knew each other before her marriage. Thomas Culpeper is one of Henry's gentlemen of the Privy Chamber, one of the king's personal attendants, young, handsome, charming. He's everything Henry used to be, and isn't anymore. Catherine had been attracted to Culpeper before her marriage. The evidence suggests they might have had some kind of relationship. Nothing serious, probably just flirtation, but there was attraction. After Catherine becomes queen, that attraction reignites. This is where the story gets complicated, where we move from established historical fact into murkier territory of who knew what when. What we know for certain, Catherine and Culpeper began meeting privately, late at night, in her private chambers, away from the full court. These meetings happened multiple times, at different palaces as the court progressed around the country. Greenwich, Hampton Court, Pontefract during the Northern Progress, in summer 1541, and Jane Boleyn facilitated these meetings. This isn't speculation. This is confirmed by multiple testimonies at the trial. Jane carried messages between Catherine and Culpeper. She arranged times and places. She stood guard outside the door while they were together. She enabled the affair, or whatever it was, from start to finish. Now comes the crucial question: why? Why would Jane Boleyn, who supposedly helped destroy Anne Boleyn for adultery 5 years earlier, turn around and facilitate an even more blatant case of queenly adultery? The traditional answer: Jane is vindictive, reckless, possibly insane. She enjoys intrigue for its own sake. She learned nothing from history and is doomed to repeat it. But this doesn't make sense. Jane isn't stupid. She's survived 20 years of court politics. She knows exactly how dangerous what Catherine is doing is. She watched Anne Boleyn die for this exact accusation. So why help Catherine? Let me propose several theories. Not one answer, but multiple possibilities that might all be partially true. Theory 1. Jane doesn't have a choice. Catherine is queen. Jane serves in her household. Her livelihood depends on royal favour. If the queen orders you to do something, even something dangerous, you do it. Saying no to a queen can get you dismissed, disgraced, possibly accused of insubordination or disloyalty. In Henry's paranoid court, that could escalate to charges of treason. Jane is in her mid-30s. She has limited income from her dower lands. Her position at court is her primary source of security. If Catherine dismisses her, she has nowhere to go. So when Catherine asks her to carry a message to Culpeper, what does Jane say? No, this is too dangerous, and risk being dismissed, losing everything. Theory 2. Jane genuinely cares about Catherine. Catherine is 17, trapped in a nightmare marriage to a rotting, terrifying old man. She's desperately unhappy, and everyone can see it. Maybe Jane feels protective, maternal even, wants to give this teenager some brief moments of happiness in an otherwise unbearable situation. Catherine found something real with Culpeper, some connection, some affection, some feeling of being desired for herself, rather than for her position. Maybe Jane decides that's worth protecting, even if it's dangerous. Theory 3. Jane is pressured by the Howard family. The Howards are using Catherine to regain political power. They need her to stay queen, keep Henry happy, maybe produce an heir. If Catherine is miserable, if she's not performing her queenly duties well, that threatens the family's position. So maybe the Howards tell Jane, keep the queen happy. Whatever she needs, make it happen. And Jane, understanding that the Howards are powerful and vindictive, complies. Theory 4. Jane has given up on self-preservation. She's lost her husband, lived through the trauma of the Boleyn fall, spent years carefully, exhaustingly navigating a court built on betrayal and sudden death. Maybe she's just exhausted, stopped caring about consequences. The constant vigilance required to survive has worn her down until she's functioning on autopilot, saying yes to requests without calculating risk anymore. Theory 5. Jane thinks they won't get caught. The meetings are discreet, late at night, in private chambers. The full court doesn't know. If Catherine and Culpeper are careful, if they limit the meetings, if they're smart about it, maybe it can continue indefinitely without discovery. Jane might think the risk is manageable. That as long as Catherine doesn't get pregnant, as long as they're careful, they can keep this secret. She's wrong. But maybe she genuinely believes they can pull it off. Any or all of these might be true. Jane's motivation is lost to history. What survives is what she did. Throughout 1541, the meetings continue. Here's what they probably looked like. Late night, Hampton Court. Most of the palace is sleeping. Catherine dismisses her other ladies for the night, sends them away with excuses. She's tired, she's praying, she wants privacy. Only Jane remains. A message was sent earlier, carried by Jane, delivered to Culpeper discreetly. A time, a place, instructions on which door to use, which corridor to avoid where guards patrol. Culpeper arrives, slips through darkened hallways, enters Catherine's private chambers through a back entrance, and Jane stands guard. She's outside the door, back against the wall, heart pounding, listening for footsteps, for guards making rounds, for other ladies who might notice the Queen's door is locked from inside. Inside the room, Catherine and Culpeper are together, talking, probably kissing, maybe more. The evidence on whether they had full intercourse is unclear and contradictory. But they're alone. Behind a closed door, a queen and a man who isn't the king. That's enough for treason. Time passes. An hour, 2 hours. Jane's legs ache from standing. Her back hurts, but she can't sit down, can't relax, has to stay alert. Finally the door opens. Culpeper emerges, dishevelled, flushed. He nods to Jane, slips back down the corridor the way he came. Jane enters Catherine's chambers, helps her undress properly for bed, rearranges anything that looks disturbed, makes sure everything appears normal. Neither of them speaks about what just happened. What's there to say? This happens multiple times. At Greenwich, at Hampton Court, at Pontefract during the Northern Progress. Each time Jane makes it possible, carries messages, arranges logistics, stands guard, enables the affair, and each time the risk grows. Because the more often they meet, the more chances someone will notice. We'll see Culpeper entering the Queen's chambers. We'll see Jane standing guard at odd hours. We'll put the pieces together. Other ladies in Catherine's household start to notice. They don't know details, but they know something is happening. They see Jane and Catherine whispering together. See Catherine sending Jane on mysterious errands. See the Queen in unusually good spirits after certain evenings. Nobody says anything. Yet, because you don't accuse a queen without absolute proof. The penalty for false accusation could be severe, but suspicions are growing, whispers starting. The court progresses north in summer 1541. This is a major royal progress. Henry visiting the north of England to show royal power after the Pilgrimage of Grace rebellion a few years earlier. They travel to York, to Hull, to Pontefract Castle, weeks on the road, the entire court travelling together, hundreds of people, thousands of horses, endless logistics, and throughout the progress, Catherine and Culpeper continue meeting, with Jane's help. This is reckless beyond belief. On progress, the court is compressed, fewer private spaces, more people aware of who's where, higher risk of discovery, but they continue anyway. Maybe because the affair has progressed too far to stop. Maybe because Catherine can't bear to give up this one source of happiness. Maybe because they've gotten away with it so far and think they're untouchable. They're not. In October 1541, the court returns to London. Everyone is exhausted. The progress was long, politically complex, draining, and Archbishop Thomas Cranmer receives information from multiple sources: letters, testimony from former servants at Lambeth, reports from people who've been watching Catherine carefully, about Catherine's past, the monarchs' relationship, the Derham marriage, evidence that Catherine wasn't a virgin when she married Henry. This is bad. If Catherine had a previous marriage contract with Derham, her marriage to Henry might be invalid. She might not be the legal queen. Cranmer investigates carefully, discreetly, gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, and he discovers something worse: the Culpeper affair, current, ongoing adultery. Not just youthful indiscretions before marriage, active treason happening right now. Letters exchanged between Catherine and Culpeper. Catherine's letters survive, passionate, affectionate, calling him her sweetheart, saying she loves him more than the world. Testimony from servants who've seen things, heard things through doors, noticed patterns, and Jane Boleyn right in the middle of it, facilitating everything. On November 2nd, 1541, All Saints' Day, Cranmer takes the information to Henry. After Mass, privately, hands Henry a letter with all the evidence laid out. Henry's reaction is devastating. He genuinely loved Catherine, called her his rose without a thorn, his perfect jewel, the young wife who made him feel young again. This betrayal destroys him. He weeps in council meetings. His advisors report seeing the king cry openly, something that almost never happens. He rages at anyone nearby, swears he'll never marry again, says women are all deceitful, untrustworthy. But beneath the heartbreak is fury. Cold, lethal fury. Someone will pay for this humiliation. Multiple people will pay. They arrest Thomas Culpeper first, probably November 11th or 12th. Take him somewhere private, begin interrogations. Culpeper's defence is brilliant, carefully calibrated to minimise his guilt while not directly lying. He admits to meeting Catherine privately, multiple times, at various palaces. He admits they talked, kissed, expressed desire for each other. But he denies intercourse, very specifically, very clearly, says they wanted to but didn't, that they met, touched, talked about what they wanted to do, but never actually consummated the relationship. It's a legal distinction that might save his life. Treason requires actual adultery, not just intention. If they didn't have sex, technically, Catherine hasn't committed the full crime. It's a good defence, won't save him, the outcome is predetermined, but it's a smart try. They arrest Francis Derham next. He confesses immediately to the premarital relationship. Says, yes, we were lovers at Lambeth. We called each other husband and wife. We probably had a marriage. Contract, though not formal. But nothing happened after she became queen, he insists. Once Catherine married Henry, the relationship ended completely. He's also trying to shift blame. Suggests that Catherine's affections moved to Culpeper, that Culpeper replaced him. It's self-serving but probably true. and they arrest Jane Boleyn. The charges: facilitating adultery, aiding and abetting the Queen in committing treason, being complicit in Catherine's relationship with Culpeper. Jane confesses immediately, doesn't try to deny it, admits everything. Yes, she carried messages. Yes, she arranged meetings. Yes, she stood guard while Catherine and Culpeper were together. But she frames it carefully. Says Catherine pressured her, that she tried to discourage the Queen, but Catherine insisted, that she was afraid to refuse. Is this true? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe partially true. Catherine probably did pressure her, but Jane also probably didn't resist very hard. It's a defense, whether genuine or strategic doesn't matter now. Catherine is questioned relentlessly. The interrogations are brutal. She's 17 years old, terrified, exhausted, has no idea how to handle this. Her answers are all over the place, contradictory, confused. Sometimes she admits to meetings with Culpeper. Sometimes she denies anything sexual happened. Sometimes she can't remember details. Sometimes she contradicts herself within the same testimony session. She's incoherent with fear, can't keep her story straight. The interrogators are threatening execution, torture, eternal damnation. She has no legal training, no experience with this, no idea what to say. What emerges from the mess of testimony? Catherine and Culpeper definitely met privately. Multiple times, various locations, late at night. Jane definitely facilitated the meetings. This is confirmed by everyone involved. Whether full intercourse occurred is unclear. Culpeper denies it. Catherine's answers are too contradictory to be useful. No one witnessed actual sex, but it doesn't matter. The treason isn't in the intercourse itself. It's in the possibility, in the potential for pregnancy, for introducing false heirs into the succession, for making the king a cuckold. Meeting privately with a man who isn't the king is enough. In December 1541, Parliament passes an Act of Attainder, legislative decree declaring Catherine Howard guilty of treason. Same for Jane Boleyn, same for Culpeper and Derham. No trial, no jury, no opportunity for defence, just Parliament voting to condemn them. Culpeper and Derham are executed on December 10th, 1541. Tyburn, public execution. Thousands watching. Culpeper, being noble, is beheaded, quick. One stroke of the axe, relatively merciful. Derham gets the full traitor's death. They hang him from the scaffold, cut him down before he's dead. He's still conscious, still breathing, can feel everything. They castrate him, cut off his genitals while he's alive and watching, throw them in a fire, then they cut open his abdomen, pull out his intestines while he's still conscious, his stomach, his organs, pile them next to the scaffold. He's screaming the entire time, begging them to finish it, begging for death. Finally, they behead him, cutting through what's left of his neck, ending it. The execution takes minutes, long, agonizing minutes of conscious suffering. The crowd watches. Some are horrified, some are fascinated. Children are lifted on shoulders for better views. This is the penalty for betraying the king. This is what happens when you sleep with a queen. The message is received. Catherine and Jane remain in the tower, waiting, knowing what's coming but not when. And this is where Jane does something extraordinary that shows exactly how intelligent and desperate she is. She goes mad, or appears to. The records from late December 1541 and January 1542 describe Jane Boleyn as having completely lost her mind, raving, incoherent, unable to speak sensibly or understand what's happening around her. She has fits of hysteria, periods where she can't communicate at all, moments where she seems completely disconnected from reality. The traditional interpretation: Jane went mad from guilt or fear. The stress broke her mind. She became genuinely insane. But look at this more carefully, more cynically. In Tudor law, there's an ancient principle: non compos mentis, not of sound mind. Insane people cannot be executed. You must be mentally competent to face execution. must understand what you're being executed for and why. It's one of the very few legal protections available, one of the only ways to escape execution once condemned. If you can convince people you're insane, you might avoid the scaffold. Jane Boleyn is a smart woman. She's navigated court politics for 20 years. She understands how legal systems work. She's seen enough executions to know what's coming. If she can make them believe she's lost her mind, she might escape execution. It's a desperate gamble. But when the alternative is definitely dying, desperate starts looking rational. The behaviours described in the records, raving, incoherent speech, fits of hysteria, inability to communicate, these are all things that can be performed, especially by someone who has nothing left to lose. And look at what happens next. Henry's response isn't sympathy, it's a new law. In January 1542, Henry pushes through Parliament an act stating that insanity is no longer a bar to execution for treason. You can be completely mad, and they can still execute you. The law is written specifically to execute Jane Boleyn. If Jane was really insane, genuinely, completely out of her mind, why would Henry need new legislation? He could just wait for a lucid moment, as genuinely insane people sometimes have, and execute her then. But if Jane was faking it and doing it convincingly enough that legal experts were arguing she couldn't be executed under current law, then Henry needed new legislation to override that protection. The law passes. Insanity is no longer a defence against execution for treason. Jane's gambit has failed. On February 9th, 1542, Jane is moved from the Tower to Sion House, a residence in the city. She's allowed several days there before execution. Historians traditionally interpret this as mercy, a final kindness, letting her spend a few days in relative comfort before death. I think it's something else. They need her coherent for the execution. Executions are public theatre. They send messages. And the message of Jane's execution needs to be clear. This is what happens when you help a queen commit adultery. Not, look at this insane woman we're executing for unclear reasons. If Jane goes to the scaffold raving and incoherent, it undermines the message, makes the execution seem unjust, raises questions about why they're killing someone who clearly doesn't understand what's happening. So they give her a few days at Sion. Let her recover. Make sure she'll be able to perform her role, walk to the scaffold calmly, make an appropriate speech, die with dignity. Because that's what condemned traitors are expected to do. Confess, ask forgiveness, warn others, die gracefully. Jane needs to be sane enough to do that. So they give her time to pull herself together. On Sunday, February 12th, 1542, Jane and Catherine are taken back to the Tower. The next morning, Monday, February 13th, 1542, they're executed. This is it, the moment Jane Boleyn's life has been building towards since she married George Boleyn 17 years ago, since she entered court service 20 years ago, since she was born into a world that gave women almost no power and punished them for trying to survive. The scaffold is built on Tower Green, same location where Anne Boleyn died 6 years earlier. Private execution, only about 50 witnesses, council members, foreign ambassadors, some nobles, a few of Catherine's ladies. It's February, cold grey London winter pressing down on everything. Catherine goes first. She has to be supported up the scaffold steps. She's shaking so hard she can barely walk. 19 years old, maybe younger. She makes a brief speech, her voice trembling. She admits she deserves death, violated God's laws and the king's laws, asks everyone to pray for her soul, begs them to pray for the king. It's what's expected, what she has to say. She kneels, positions her neck on the block. The wood is dark with old bloodstains. Anne Boleyn's blood, other traitors' blood, soaked into the grain. The executioner raises the axe, one stroke, clean. Catherine Howard's head separates from her body. Blood sprays from the severed neck, soaking into the scaffold wood. Her body jerks, nerve impulses, muscles firing randomly. Then still. They wrap her in cloth, carry the body away. She'll be buried in the Tower Chapel. Next, to Anne Boleyn, next to George Boleyn. All the Howards and Boleyns who bet everything on royal favour and lost. And then it's Jane's turn. She climbs the scaffold steps, steady now, composed. Whatever madness she displayed in the tower is gone, or was never real. She's dressed simply, black gown, her hair covered. She looks older than her 36 or 37 years. The strain shows in her face, in the lines around her eyes and mouth, but she's calm, controlled. This is her final performance, the last time anyone will see her, the last words anyone will hear from her. She's going to make them count. Her speech is longer than Catherine's, more carefully constructed, and this is crucial. Pay attention to how she frames this. She admits her guilt, has to. Denying guilt on the scaffold is itself treason. You can't question the king's justice even while it's killing you. But listen to what she actually says. She's dying for concealing the Queen's actions, for not speaking up when she should have, for helping Catherine meet with Culpeper instead of immediately reporting it. Not for committing adultery herself, not for plotting against the king, not for any active crime, for concealing, for silence, for not betraying a queen she served. It's a subtle distinction, but crucial. She's saying, I'm being executed, not for what I did, but for what I didn't say, for failing to report treason rather than committing it. She's also saying something else, something that echoes across the centuries. Don't trust in worldly things. Don't trust princes or power or position. Trust only in God, because everything else, all the wealth, all the favour, all the security you think you have, can be taken away in an instant. On a whim, for reasons you can't control. She's speaking from 20 years of experience, watching her husband executed for crimes he probably didn't commit, watching Anne Boleyn destroyed by fabricated charges, watching Catherine Howard, a teenager, die for finding brief happiness with a man who wasn't her husband. Trust nothing, she's saying, because power is arbitrary. Justice is whatever the king says it is, and women especially have no protection, no safety, no guarantee that doing everything right will save you. It's a bitter truth, the distillation of her entire life into one warning. She finishes her speech, kneels at the block, positions her neck carefully. The executioner has done this hundreds of times, knows exactly where to aim. Jane closes her eyes. Her lips move, probably praying, though no one records what she says. The executioner raises the axe, 8 pounds of sharpened steel, 4-foot handle, 1 smooth motion. The axe falls, 1 stroke, clean. Jane Boleyn's head separates from her body. Her head hits the straw scattered on the scaffold. Blood pools around the severed neck. The body slumps forward. Still, Jane Boleyn, Viscountess Rochford, is dead. They wrap her body in cloth, carry it to the Tower Chapel, bury her next to Catherine Howard, next to Anne Boleyn, next to her husband, George. The chapel is filling up with bodies, all victims of Henry VIII, all executed for treason, all destroyed by getting too close to power. Jane gets no monument, no elaborate tomb, no marker, just earth over her coffin. Another woman silenced forever, and immediately, almost before her body is cold, her reputation starts to twist. Within years, Jane Boleyn is being written about as a villain. The jealous sister-in-law who destroyed Anne, the corrupt lady-in-waiting who enabled Catherine's adultery. By the 17th century, she's a stock character in histories of the period, the toxic in-law, the woman who betrayed her family out of spite. By the 19th century, she's the madwoman, the hysteric who went insane from guilt. By the 20th century, she's been analysed, psychologized, and condemned by generations of historians who need her to be a monster. Because if Jane isn't evil, then we have to confront something uncomfortable. that Tudor England destroyed people indiscriminately, that women had almost no power and almost no good choices. That survival often meant doing terrible things or being complicit in terrible things because the alternative was death. If Jane is just a victim of circumstances, then we can't use her story as a morality tale. Can't warn about the dangers of female jealousy or ambition. We have to acknowledge that the system itself was the problem. But let's look at what we actually know about Jane Boleyn's life. Strip away the assumptions and inventions and look at the facts. Born around 1505 to an educated but not powerful family. Served in Queen's households from her late teens. Married George Boleyn around 1525. Had no children. May or may not have testified in 1536. The evidence is thin and contradictory. Survived the Boleyn fall. Worked her way back to court by 1540. Served Catherine Howard and helped facilitate her affair with Culpeper. Was arrested, convicted, and executed in February 1542. Possibly faked madness to try to escape execution. That's it. That's what survives. Everything else, the jealousy, the vindictiveness, the toxic behaviour, the madness, is interpretation. Stories built on sparse evidence, assumptions filling gaps. And for 5 centuries, those assumptions have been overwhelmingly negative. But what if we've been wrong? What if Jane Boleyn was just a woman trying to survive in an impossible world, making choices with limited information and no power? Doing what she had to do to stay alive when every option was terrible? Consider her father, Lord Morley, Henry Parker, still alive when Jane was executed, still writing his religious treatises and translations. How did he react to his daughter's execution? We don't know. He doesn't write about it, doesn't mention it in any surviving letters or works, just silence. Did he disown her? Mourn her? Try to intervene? The records don't say. Maybe he was too ashamed. Maybe he tried and failed. Maybe he just retreated into his books and pretended it hadn't happened. But imagine being him. You raised your daughter to be pious, obedient, virtuous, educated her carefully, got her placed at court, watched her marry well, and then watched her executed for treason. That silence speaks volumes. What happened to Jane's property after her death? Her dower lands from George's estate, confiscated, reverted to the crown, distributed to other people. Jane's family got nothing. Who benefited from her execution? Who took her property? The records are fragmentary, but some of her lands went to people who'd been loyal to Henry through the Catherine Howard scandal. Rewards for service. Jane's death enriched others, as executions always did. And how was she remembered immediately after death? With silence mostly. Chronicles mention her execution briefly. Note that Lady Rochford was executed alongside Catherine Howard for facilitating adultery. Some mention the madness. That's it. No elaborate condemnations, no detailed character assassination, just brief factual statements. The monster making comes later, decades later. When writers who never knew her, who weren't there, who had political axes to grind, started shaping her into whatever villain their narratives needed. The first detailed attack on Jane's character comes from Spanish chroniclers in the 1550s and 60s. They're writing from a Catholic perspective, condemning the Protestant Boleyn family as heretics and degenerates. In their telling, Jane is vindictive, jealous, sexually deviant, everything bad. She destroyed Anne and George out of pure spite, helped Catherine out of wickedness. English Protestant chroniclers push back slightly, but not much. They don't defend Jane. They just focus elsewhere. She's not important enough to their narratives to spend time on. By the 17th century, Jane has become a stock figure. Dramatists use her as a villain. Historians repeat earlier accounts without questioning them. She hardens into legend. And here's what's insidious about this process. Once someone becomes a stock villain, every new generation just accepts it. Nobody goes back to primary sources. Nobody questions whether the earlier writers might have been wrong. Jane Boleyn was a vindictive witch becomes fact through sheer repetition. Even modern historians, who should know better, often just accept the traditional narrative. They hedge slightly, say allegedly and supposedly, but still present Jane as probably guilty of the worst interpretations. Because it's easier than admitting we don't actually know. It's easier to have a villain than to sit with uncertainty. But uncertainty is the only honest position. We don't know if Jane testified against George and Anne. The evidence is too thin. We don't know why she helped Catherine. Multiple explanations are plausible. We don't know if her madness was real or performed. Both are possible. We don't know what she actually thought or felt about any of it. All we know is that she died, and that 500 years of historians have turned her into a monster to serve their own narrative purposes. Maybe it's time to stop. Maybe it's time to admit that Jane Boleyn deserves better than 5 centuries of certain judgment based on uncertain evidence. She was a woman who lived in a world designed to destroy women, who navigated impossible politics with no power, who made choices where all options were bad, who survived longer than most, and who ultimately died for concealing information she may have been forced to conceal. That's not a villain story. That's a tragedy. The real villain isn't Jane Boleyn. It's Henry VIII and the system he presided over. The court that treated people as disposable. The monarchy built on terror and execution. The world that gave women no good choices and then blamed them for the choices they made. Jane Boleyn was just one more victim of that system. One more body in the tower. One more woman history has misjudged. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, think about Jane Boleyn. Not as the toxic in-law, not as the jealous sister, not as the mad woman or the enabler or the villain. Think about her as a woman, 36 years old, kneeling on a scaffold, about to die. Think about the impossible choices she faced, the world she navigated, the terror she must have felt, the desperate hope that maybe faking madness would save her. Think about her last words, warning everyone that worldly power is worthless, that everything can be taken away in an instant, that the only safety is in God because human systems are arbitrary and cruel. And think about 500 years of historians deciding she was evil without ever really knowing her. Jane Boleyn deserves better. She deserves doubt instead of certainty, questions instead of answers, the acknowledgement that we simply don't know her story fully. She deserves to be human instead of monstrous. Rest well, Jane Boleyn. You've been misunderstood long enough, and maybe, just maybe, it's time history started telling your story with more honesty and less judgment. Good night.